Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ambleside. Very glad to see people from all over the world. I think you're all in your mid-career. I also went back to school when I turned 40, actually. That was my 40th birthday present to myself, and it was a great experience. I think you get out so much more from schooling in general once you have professional experience. So I hope this experience is going to be as rewarding to you as it was for me a couple of years ago. All right, let's get straight into the subject matter. I'm going to give you a little test. I'm happy a few of you come from the continent. Do you know which flags those countries represent?
Yeah.
Romania.
Yeah.
Romania.
Senegal.
Yes. India.
Not India.
Chad.
I heard something.
Chad.
Yeah.
Yes, Chad.
Chad.
And Niger.
Yeah.
Niger.
No. You got 2 out of 3.
Isn't that Iran?
Mali.
Okay.
Chad.
Let's see if this works.
Senegal.
So Niger, Chad, and Guinea-Conakry. Well done. Where are you from?
From South Africa.
South Africa. You know your flags well. Okay, I think I need to stand here. Okay. All right, so that's where those countries are located. And I want to ask you, apart from the fact that they're all in Africa, obviously, what do you think are the commonalities among those 3 countries?
All colonized by French.
Yeah?
There's 2 locked countries.
Yeah, 2 landlocked countries, Chad and Niger.
Yeah. And a small country.
That's small.
Yeah. Ghana, Guinea.
Niger and Chad are, I mean, yeah.
No, I mean Guinea.
Guinea-Conakry is very small.
Very small.
Niger and Chad, not really.
Then the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
Is Guinea in the Sahara?
Sorry.
Is Guinea in the Sahara?
So Guinea-Conakry is not. It's actually a beautiful country. Guinea-Conakry, very green, no desert. It's a very green, lush.
Okay, we give up.
You give up, okay. So they're the world's poorest countries. So if you look at the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index, the HDI, which looks at a number of criteria related to general development and poverty. Those 3 countries are at the very bottom of the HDI. So Niger is the 2nd poorest country in the world, Chad the 3rd poorest, and Guinea the 6th poorest. Life expectancy in Chad is 51 years old. In Niger, it's about 56 years old. And the average income of people living in those countries is below $1.5 a day. Are they the world's richest countries?
Wow.
So Niger is the 4th largest producer of uranium in the world. It leads 1 out of 3 light bulbs in France. It produces so much uranium, it exports most of it to France through a company called Areva, and about 1 in 3 of the light bulbs in France are lit up thanks to the uranium produced in Niger. Chad has the 10th largest oil reserves in the world, and Guinea is the largest bauxite reserve. Do you know what bauxite is? Yeah, what you produce aluminum. So what's going on? You have oil, you should be rich.
You're students. They don't tell you anything.
So many of you come from very, what we call resource-rich countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Yemen, Mozambique. Those are what we call resource-rich countries. They are countries extremely rich in natural resources, in oil, gas, minerals, including gold, diamonds. Yet, many of them are very poor from what we call, from an HDI perspective. So that's what we call the resource curse. So a country with plenty of natural resources, which could be, should be good news to people, end up being the poorest countries in the world. And that's kind of counterintuitive, right? You'd think like, oh, we have oil, we'll become like Norway, one of the richest countries in the world. But by and large, Norway is a great exception to that rule of the resource curse. So what's the resource curse? The resource curse is a complex phenomenon, socio-economic, political phenomenon that makes those resource-rich countries often the poorest in the world. Not only that, but they often have high level of inequality and poverty. More than 2.5 billion people living with less than $2 a day live in resource-rich countries. Usually that's also linked to weak institutions, weak rule of law, which often is associated also with conflict. So many of you must have heard about conflict diamonds or conflict minerals. Often those minerals or the oil, like in Libya at the moment, fuel civil strife and conflict in those countries. And they're also characterized by a high level of corruption. So that's what I'm going to focus the coming 1 hour of my talk on, because that's what I work on. So corruption in that sector is only one of the aspects of the resource curse, but it's an important one. So President Mugabe last year on the day of his birthday, which is when he addresses the nation, announced that $15 billion from the diamond trade had gone missing, and he didn't know where that money was. My own members get arrested, if not worse, almost on a daily level. So it is a dangerous sector to work in, especially because when you address corruption in the oil, gas, and mining sector, you usually challenge very powerful economic and political vested interests, maybe more so than any other industrial sector. So that's one thing. Secondly, yes, corruption is not just a Zimbabwean affair. It's not just a Venezuelan affair. It is facilitated by a very large and complex networks of banks, money launderers, insurance companies that are mostly based in the global north, in the city of London, just a few kilometers away from here, who facilitate illicit financial flows, tax havens, shell companies, and so on and so forth. So I'll touch on that as well. Corruption is not a problem of developing countries and poor countries. Corruption affects everyone, and it's facilitated, as I said again, by a network of often elites from the south and the north that robs people of the revenues generated by the exploitation of those natural resources. So, so what's corruption? So corruption, like this slide shows you that corruption is not just about bribing an official to get a contract, right? Corruption is complex, and it's getting increasingly complex. So it's about embezzlement, misappropriation of public funds, abuse of office, trading in influence, extortion, illegal payments, offshore transactions, different corporate structures that allow companies to shift profits in jurisdictions where there's less taxes, clientelism, patronage. All of this is happening every day, and it's happening a lot in the extractive sector. So the OECD just came out with a report a couple of months ago saying that 1 out of 5 cases of transnational bribery happens in that sector, in the oil, gas, and mining sector. It is making the news. It's not like people don't know that stuff is happening, right? Almost every other day, you have a major feature in newspapers, either local or international, saying, oh, billions have been missing here. Oh, we've just discovered a shady deal here. Oh, we've just realized that this company doesn't actually exist. It's just a registered address in Panama. You know, like those things are in the open in our eyes, like every day. I don't know if you guys have heard of OPL 245. Is there someone from Nigeria here? I can't remember. Yeah, have you heard of that case? Yeah, yeah, this person is Kensaru Ruwa. He was executed 20 years ago for opposing Shell's operation in the Niger Delta, together with 9 other activists who were protesting Shell's, not necessarily Shell's access to the resources, right? Like a lot of the people we work with are not environmental activists. They just want to make sure that the people benefit from the revenues generated by the exploitation of oil or minerals, right? So Kensaru had also environmental concerns about the extensive destruction of livelihoods in the Niger Delta for people who live there. So, whether it's gas flaring or pollution, there are some issues related to the environment in the Niger Delta. But it was also, people just asking to be part of the decision-making process, to be informed, to be seen as relevant stakeholder in those oil operations. So just to jump onto OPL 245, which is a very current corruption case where Shell is involved. And I'm not making that up. It's, again, very publicly known in newspapers that Shell, so this is one of the richest oil deposits in the world, OPL 245. It's an offshore oil field, which Shell acquired a couple of years ago for a few $1 billion that they paid to the government. And there is increasing evidence that Shell knew that a lot of that money would go straight to a former minister who is also well known for laundering money. And increasingly, the case is advancing. There's a lot of investigative journalists who are working on that case, following where the money went. And guess what? It didn't go to the people of Nigeria. It didn't even reach the state coffers. It was siphoned right away to an offshore bank account by some public officials. Whether Shell knew or not is the question on the table at the moment. So Shell's well-paid lawyers are saying they didn't know, but there is evidence in email and so on that the CEO of Shell knew at the time that this money to acquire that particular oil field would not be put to good use. So that's a very current corruption story that's still ongoing in Nigeria. And just to put, again, relate that to the concerns of people in this country. Obviously, the money that went off to an offshore bank account could have put many girls, and here the example is about girls in school in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, an estimated 5.5 million girls are out of school, 1.1 billion, which is what Shell paid to acquire that field to the government of Nigeria, could have paid for 1.7 million of them to go to school for 5 years each. Well, those girls will never go to school because that money is gone, unless there's a court case that makes Shell or the government pay it back. So what to do? So I spend my day in and out working on those issues and trying to affect change at national and global levels. One of the, so we're an anti-corruption movement. We have member organizations, 700 member organizations in more than 40 countries, many in Africa, many in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Canada, Alaska, and Europe as well. And we work together to bring transparency to the sector. Our theory of change is that if people have access to information, and especially fiscal payments related to the sector, then they'll be able to use that information to hold their governments to account for the revenues generated by the exploitation of natural resources. So our theory of change is quite simple. It's like give information to people who are affected by the extraction, and then they'll be able to use it to say, hey, we know that this project has generated that much million. We still don't have a school in that village. Where has the money gone? And what have you done with it. So it's kind of trying to generate a public debate in resource-rich countries about the revenues generated by the extraction of oil, gas, or minerals. One way we've done that is by establishing a voluntary industry transparency initiative. So Publish What You Pay was one of the founders of the EITI back in 2002. So the EITI is, again, a voluntary multi-stakeholder initiative whereby companies, so some of those are illustrated here, governments and civil society players, so NGOs, organized grassroots organizations, come around the table to discuss and agree on a global transparency standard for the extractive sector. So there is a standard, a piece of paper, it's called the EITI standard, that's been negotiated over the past 15 years among government, NGOs, and companies that prescribes what a transparent sector would look like throughout the entire extractive value chain. So from the time where you explore, whether there's oil or mineral resources, to the time where you actually exploit the resource, where you generate revenues and you invest those revenues. So if you look at the value chain at the top, it's about licensing and contract. How does the government award licenses to Shell or to others? What is the process? How transparent or untransparent is it? Monitoring the production, collecting the taxes, the royalties, the production fees, and then revenue distribution and expenditure management. So the EITI looks at all of that, and there is a list of criteria that governments that are part of the initiative and companies need to abide by in order to remain members of the initiative. The initiative, as I said, is completely voluntary. So governments join, companies join in a show of willingness to address the issue together. So especially like in countries like Zimbabwe, where there's limited opportunities for NGOs to engage with their government, because it's just not the way it works in that country, the EITI provides an opportunity to sit at the table with your government officials and the companies and discuss governance in the sector together. So this is really, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative. There are others in other sectors. So for instance, in forestry, there's something called the Forest Stewardship Council, which is not unlike the EITI. It's a standard that, if you buy wood in Europe now and you want sustainably sourced wood to build your shed, often you'll have this FSC trademark on the wood, which says that piece of wood doesn't come from primary forest, it doesn't come from indigenous people's lands, or if it does, they've given us prior and informed consent to log their forest, and so on and so forth. So it's a stamp of approval, and where governments and companies are involved. So there's two parts in the EITI process. There's how you capture the value, the wealth of the natural resource, and how then you invest it, right? So the EITI tries to trace that flow of money, revenues generated by the exploitation of resources. So it's about the allocation of rights, production, revenue collection. Then often you have a state-owned company that plays, it's not just the Shells and the BPs of this world. There's a lot of state-owned oil and mining companies that are owned by the government, that are important players in that field. And then those in turn make subnational payments to subnational authorities and invest in education or health or infrastructure and others. So the EITI look at how the value is captured and where do the benefits go. The way they do that is by having the companies disclose the payments they make, so the royalties they've paid to the government, the fees, the taxes, and then the government also reports what they've received. And so the EITI process is about reconciling those two sets of figures. And not surprisingly, often they don't match, right? So a company will say, oh, we've paid that much to government, it doesn't show in the government books. Like, Where did that go? And so that's when the multi-stakeholder dialogue starts. You know, if Shell says we've paid project by project, they disclose we've paid that much to the local authority in that state, or we've paid that much in royalties to the government, to the central government. And the government is like, well, actually, you know, on the books, there's only half of it. So what happens is that then some of the governments, you know, like the figures, they're self-reported figures. But that's where civil society comes in, because they're able to kind of, you know, if they're well educated and able to read an EITI report, which is not a given, they're able to see signs that something might not be right. So we're training, you know, we're training our activists in investigative work to kind of look at those reports, and not so much what they say, but what they don't say. So it's an investigative work. We work with a lot of investigative journalists as well. But at least now we have the figures. If only 10 years ago you didn't have any of those figures, you didn't know what Shell paid in terms of, you know, in royalties to the government of Nigeria. You didn't know. You didn't know. And the government wasn't necessarily disclosing either, right? So at least now it's in the open and people have access to it. So it's the beginning of a conversation to follow that money, to see like project by, and they disclose project by project. So you have a mine somewhere, or you have like an oil field somewhere, you're gonna have that reporting for every single project in a country. So it's that level of granularity that becomes really interesting, especially for the communities that live near the projects and that are affected by the project, because it's like, oh, okay, so that mine generated like 100,000, you know, million last year. How come we still don't have a school? How come we don't have a road? Why is that money gone? So there again, at the local level, they can engage in a dialogue with their local authorities, their mayor. Often the local authorities are also as helpless as the NGOs. They're like, we don't know where that money went, right? Like, we have no clue, because it's happening in the capital city. So it's the beginning of a conversation. And that's already, according to us, it's already a big step forward. Then we work also on other, sorry. So there's another thing we do, which is that, so the EITI is completely voluntary, so there are issues with that. In fact, the governments that don't want to participate don't participate, the companies that don't want to participate don't participate. So what we've done, and again, that's the result of years of campaigning around the world, is that we've now helped pass legislation, so that's not optional, it's legislation that require extractive companies to disclose their payments to governments. So there's now legislation, it's called mandatory disclosure legislation in the EU in the form of the EU directives on accounting and transparency. There's a similar law in Canada called ESTMA, the Extractive Sector Transparency Act. There's a similar law in Norway that's called the, I think, country by country reporting law. Why is it important that those laws are in those countries? Because most of the multinational extractive companies are listed on the stock exchange in those countries. And those laws apply to those companies listed in those jurisdictions to the extractive companies that are listed in London, in Paris, in the US, in Canada. Canada has the most mining companies in the world. There's thousands of mining companies registered in Canada that operate from Nigeria to Zimbabwe, Zambia, Latin America. I'm sure in Venezuela there's tons of like Canadian mining companies. Now all those mining companies have to disclose every payment they make to the countries in which they have operations, ongoing operations. Same for BP. Where is BP registered? British Petroleum. It's registered in London, in the city of London. It's now caught by this EU directive, this EU accounting directive, and BP now has to tell us publicly, okay, we've paid that much to that government, that much to that government, that much to that government, that much government, and they don't have a choice. Shell does it. It's their second report. They tell us we've paid that much in taxes, that much in royalties, that much in license fees, that much in blah, blah, blah. I'll show you one of the examples of those reports. They're just coming out now. So we've been campaigning for 15 years on that, and the first reports are coming out. So here you see BP, BHP, so British Petroleum, BHP Billiton, one of the largest mining companies in the world, Glencore, Anglo-American. What do they have in common, those 4 companies? They're all registered in the City of London. And so they all have to report under the UK law, which is the transposition of the EU directive. And look, there's like 22 countries, just those 4 companies have reported payments publicly that they've made to those 4 countries. So they have operations in all these countries. So, you know, there's Zambia, South Africa, Tanzania, DRC, Qatar, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Iraq, China, Zimbabwe. So what does that mean? For the citizens of those countries, they can go online now and go like, I wonder what Anglo-American paid the government of Zimbabwe last year for their operations. And that's all public information, whether the government wants it or the companies want it, because it's law. So it's very different from the EITI. And there again, it gives access to citizens to look at those reports. So again, we train our people to come. So that's fiscal analysis, right? Those reports are quite complicated to read. I'll show you an example. So that's an ESTMA report. So that kind of links to an issue that some of you may be interested in, is climate change and the role that the extractive sector plays in climate change. Are any of you interested in climate change or environmental sustainability? All right, this sector contributes, you know, so not just the extraction of oil, but the burning of oil in, you know, to run our cars, to run our energy generation plants and all of that, is contributing to the destruction of the planet. And so, you know, I think there's almost an existential question for the sector about its survival in this kind of transition to a low carbon economy that many governments have committed to at the Paris conference a couple of years ago to reduce CO2 emissions, right? So what does that transition to a low carbon economy mean for a sector whose success and survival depends on us burning more and more oil every day, or mining more and more diamonds. You know, we're successful. We've been very successful as a campaign because we're a single issue, and we're focused on something that's quite narrow and technical, and we're able to progress. That's how we chose our kind of model. Other organizations take care of the environmental piece, of the employment piece, of the health piece, of the human rights piece. We're not even a human rights organization, although I'm going to talk about that. But you know, again, our theory of change is that we want to give people information that they can use to hold their governments accountable for the revenues generated by the exploitation of oil, gas, and minerals. That's a very narrow mission, but if we stick at it, we manage to get some impact. So we are actually at the moment trying to develop a position on climate change because we don't have one, you know, so just that people know where we're coming from on that issue, but we're not going to start campaigning on that. Actually on climate change, the only relevant aspect that could come into play for our work on corruption and fiscal payments is the fact that, so it takes us a little further away from my presentation, but if you assume that governments are going to cut, you know, honor their Paris commitment and cut their CO2 emissions.
Like US.
That means that some of the oil reserves against which those extractive companies are valued on the international market will not be exploitable, right? So there's a specific term for that. They're basically assets that will not be productive assets because you can't exploit them. And so if and when international financial markets realize that, the value of the share of those companies is going to plunge. And you know, from our perspective, that has a relevance because we think that there's a lot of corruption risk associated to such a realization.
To what you report of emission and
exactly, yeah. So what we're campaigning for at the EITI at the moment is fiscal risks associated to climate change that the companies, we want a company like Shell to disclose that, how they think climate change is affecting their business model and their valuation on international markets. But they don't want to do it. Those contracts that governments and companies used to sign or signed used to be completely secret.
Yeah.
And increasingly, again, because of years of lobbying, they're coming out in the open. Not always. So for instance, the contract between Areva, the French nuclear company, and the government of Niger. So Niger changed its constitution like 3 or 4 years ago. And in the new constitution, thanks to all our groups in Niger who are, fighters, in the constitution of Niger now, there is a clause that requires the publication of extractive contracts. So when an oil or a mining company signs a contract with the government has committed in the constitution to make it public. So Areva and Niger renegotiated their agreement. They had a 75-year-long contract. The people of Niger were like, we want to renegotiate that contract. We don't know the terms of that contract. We want the government, get a better deal with Areva. They renegotiated the contract 2 years ago. The contract is still not available publicly. So the government who changed its own constitution is also breaching it right away by not publishing the new contract. And Areva, so we're also campaigning a lot in Areva, with Areva in Paris. They also don't want to disclose the contract. Why? Because the government of Niger got a really bad deal. And so the day it puts the contract out in the open, you can be sure that the citizens are not going to be happy. So, so there's more and more transparency on contract, not always. But again, those contracts are extremely complicated legal documents, and we're training our people to read those documents and try to see if the country got a good deal or a bad deal. Most of the time, the country got a bad deal because, unfortunately, the officials don't have Harvard law degrees, whereas the company lawyers have those degrees. And so there's a very unequal negotiating
So the
field.
fault and the corruption is really on the Western side.
Yeah, the companies don't care whether the country is going to get a good deal. They want a good deal for themselves, meaning not paying taxes, not paying people who are going to work in the mine, not providing for anything. That's.
And the lack of disclosure is pure embarrassment on behalf of
Yeah.
the mountains.
Okay, let me see. Okay, let me just show these two last slides. So as transparency led to accountability. So for us, transparency is not an end in itself. You can have all these reports publicly available, and then what? If behaviors don't change, then transparency is no good. So for us, what we want to see is that transparency is actually going to lead to behavioral changes from those governments and from those companies, better deals for the people, more schools, more roads, more clinics. And so what we're seeing now is that actually that theory of change that we had, that we're like, oh, we just provide more information to the people and then they'll be able to hold their governments to account, has not really happened. So there is more information out in the open, but civil society still gets arrested when they ask uncomfortable questions. And that's partly, and that's my last slide, because of closing civic space. So the fact that fundamental freedoms, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, are increasingly being criminalized in many countries, including in resource-rich countries. And as I said, we're not a human rights organization, but it's becoming the elephant in the room for us because our people, our activists are more busy protecting their lives, their family, their children, their house from attacks than exposing corruption. One of my board members was in jail 2 months ago. I got a call on Saturday night. He had just said that his government was not being accountable for the revenues generated by the extraction of minerals. And then he was in jail the following day, right? And so for us, the reason why we're not getting that level of accountability is because we're hitting a wall, basically, where governments don't tolerate dissent. They don't tolerate public debate on those issues. It goes back to what I was saying, because it challenges very powerful vested interests. So we produced a report last year called Against All Odds, looking at how governments push back against activists, anti-corruption activists, by many means. So one of the more classic ways to shut down civil society voices is to make it very difficult for them to register NGOs. So in Ethiopia, in Congo Brazza, in Kazakhstan, in Azerbaijan, in Russia. In many countries, there's NGO laws that are so restrictive that people can't even establish non-profit organizations. They have to fill in like thousands of papers, and even if they manage to register, then each time something changes, they need to re-register. And if they don't do that, then they get thrown in jail because they're not respecting the NGO law. Another way to shut down civil society voices is to make it impossible for them to get foreign funding. The argument is one I heard in this room is that NGOs are in the hands of foreign powers, that they're that if especially if they question the development model of the country, they're anti-patriotic. An NGO that will question whether a country should exploit its oil or not can be very easily labeled anti-patriotic if the oil revenues constitute the vast majority of the state revenues, and that's the case in many resource-rich countries. The majority of state revenues in those resource-rich countries come from the exploitation of natural resources. So as a citizen, if you question that, you can be very easily labeled anti-patriotic with all the criminal and legal consequences that this implies. So I think I'll end to that. I just want to test if you remember those flags before I close. So which one? Which one is Guinea?
This one.
The left.
Left is what?
Chad.
There are three countries with that.
There are three countries, that's right.
Chad,
Yeah, which one is which?
It's rounds.
Yeah.
The bottom one is
I know you know. Like I just want like a consensus here. So the one with the round orange thing. Great. The one above?